The way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce this panel all in a row. And I would ask you, as you're listening to these speakers, you'll note that there are index cards on your table. And if you could write down questions that you have for the speakers, you can raise them up and we'll have students who will come and retrieve them from you. And that way, you can ask as many questions as you like. We have plenty of time scheduled. You can do it in an anonymous fashion. Ask whatever you want. So please do. So our first speaker is Evan Glassman. He is president and CEO of New Paradigm. He's going to discuss parametric insurance with us, as you know, because I think Sam mentioned that to you as well. And Don, Evan spent the better part of his career as an insurance agent in South Florida. He recognized that there was a tremendous difference between his clients' need to recover from hurricanes versus the coverage provided by traditional insurance policies, because it often takes months or years to process traditional insurance claims, as you all know. An alternative solution was not available at that time in the insurance market, so I'll leave it to him to tell you about what he did about that. Suffice it to say, he has hands-on experience with the benefits and shortcomings of traditional insurance in the disaster recovery setting, and plenty of knowledge to share with us today. Dawn Zimmer is with Energy and Sustainability Services at Schneider Electric. She is the former mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey. She served there as the 38th mayor and the first female mayor. She was first elected mayor in a special election in November 2009 and re-elected mayor for another 4-year term in November of 2013. So she was lucky enough to be mayor during Hurricanes Irene and Sandy. Congratulations. Clearly, she has many valuable lessons learned to share with us as well. And then we have Gori Gadgil, project coordinator for environmental impact bonds with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where she leads work on a pilot project to introduce new financing tools to local governments for green infrastructure and stormwater management projects. And I will note that CBF is working with Hampton in our own region on an environmental impact bond now. So she brings some information about a local project as well. Okay, I was busy writing down questions, so now I have to figure out what we're doing. If anyone has questions written on an index card, please hold it up and our students will come and get it from you. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our panel. He's going to come up and discuss some issues with the panelists and also field your questions. Our moderator today is David Johnston. He is with Hamilton Advisors. He's the CEO of Hamilton Advisors, LLC, which is a South Carolina-based company that works across private, non-governmental, and public sectors to address domestic and international challenges associated with disaster mitigation, response, recovery, and adaptation. He works with a broad range of organizations from Honolulu to Paris to Colorado, Washington, D.C., and he's going to draw upon his more than 30 years of experience as a lawyer and a businessman to moderate the panel. He's also on the executive committee of the Charleston Resilience Network, which is partnering with the City of Charleston and the Water Institute of the Gulf to bring the Dutch dialogues to Charleston this week. So we appreciate David joining us. He had to leave that early to come up here to be with us. So thank you, David. If you could come on up.
I don't have any slides, so you don't have to do anything. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm looking at all the questions that have come in and sort of getting them organized, and the good news is there are a lot of them. The bad news is I am just seeing them for the first time. But great to be here, and hello from South Carolina, where I live. This has been a wonderful day for me so far. I've heard a lot and learned a lot from a lot of really smart people. And I've been around and doing this stuff for a while. But again, I've heard things today that I had no idea about. So and in talking with some of you in the breaks, there's a lot to digest. It's been a little fire hose-like today. So one of the things, one of my objectives here is to try to connect the dots a little bit on what we've heard, identify a few common themes that I think have come out of the conversation, which interestingly are very similar to common themes I've encountered in other communities, and then get the smart guys to talk. They're the experts. I've got some questions for them, and interestingly, questions from the audience are very similar. I spent a lot of my time trying to bring groups together to create sort of collaborative strategies to solve complex weather-related problems. My first experience and exposure was in post-tsunami Indonesia. And that was my first look at what could happen and just the incredible importance of collaboration and cooperation and understanding and listening among various groups. And I think that's equally critical in the States, in large and small communities. And we've heard it different ways today, but I think one of the common themes is the absolute need for collaboration, partnerships, or as Don put it, and I've not heard it put quite this way before, transaction engineering. A marvelous way to put it. Another common theme is we need solutions, and we need them now. A lot of discussion over the last years about the issues we're talking about, and there may be a little fatigue about talking about the problems without figuring out how to solve them. And as importantly, maybe more importantly, how to pay for them. I hear that all the time, and that's why the timing and the focus of this forum is so timely and so important and critical to large and small communities, cross-sector organizations to move this forward. Final common theme is the importance of approaching these challenges on a regional basis. Regional across town sizes, community sizes, geographic areas. I'm finding in our experience, certainly over the years and now in South Carolina, that the buy-in, the socializing, of various communities in creating solutions is critical to effective solutions. And I think as we talk through what can be done, what can be done, I think those three themes are important to us. I've got a series of questions that I'd like, the panel is great, and they have different but very interesting experience. And my hope is this is sort of a free flow, the conversation with back and forth and questions from the audience, even if you haven't asked them already, so we can get some good ideas on the table. One question for all three panelists is, what is the most effective way to engage the business community to help the rest of the sectors that need to be engaged in solving these problems, committed, writing checks, and putting their weight behind the solving of problems? Dawn, you want to start with that one because you've been through that?
Yeah, we worked really hard to make sure that the business community, we wanted their support and we worked very hard to get them involved in the Rebuild by Design process and get their input, and had separate meetings with them. We had separate meetings with the developers because, again, we recognize if the development community is totally against what we're doing, then we're going to have some challenges. And so I think going forward that there's an opportunity, because Rebuild by Design there's actually new development areas, and all of that development will benefit from Rebuild by Design. So, I think that there potentially is an opportunity to sort of tap into that through the redevelopment agreements as those. So I did a lot of plans, and then as the final negotiations are done, those redevelopment agreements can go towards helping to fund things like the maintenance. That will be the next challenge is, once we get this project built out, how are you going to maintain it? We've done, as part of our redevelopment process, we've done requirements to make a contribution to the open space trust fund as well. You know, and then right after Sandy, I mean, we did a big fundraising event just to try to help residents, because in an urban area, getting funding from the flood insurance program was another major challenge. So we fundraised on our own from the business community over $1 million to help residents, and then we worked with our local clergy to distribute that funding out. So,
Has the business community continued to be interested? And often there's interest immediately after a disaster, and then it wanes.
yeah, I mean, that's always the challenge is, you know, you have new people moving in, and, you know, and sometimes people feel like, well, it happened a long time ago, and, you know, it was like a 300-year storm, so it's not going to happen again for another. No, it doesn't work that way. It's just a percentage chance, and quite frankly, I mean, I feel like every year it's like, let's just make sure this is done before the next storm hits. But yeah, that is always, you know, I think the biggest thing that we've done is, and the new mayor that I supported has done is to just keep that communication going. Like, you have to, if you think you're communicating with the community, you're probably not, you know. So I mean, whether it's newsletters, through social media, and then having various meetings, you know, whether it's with the business community or throughout the city, having drop-in sessions. Like, it's an ongoing you know, process to really keep the community engaged. And that continues because that process is they're moving towards the final design for the project.
Thanks. Evan, what about you?
Yeah, this one is not as appropriate for me, but what we're doing, and a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're doing is taking this concept of parametric and making it more mainstream. So it's not an esoteric, exotic concept. And when more and more businesses buy, more and more public entities are going to buy, and the proof's really in the pudding after the event. And I'm regularly talking to business owners, and these are very, very large corporations in some cases, and they spend a lot of money to harden their facilities, so their plants, their factories. We're designed, we can withstand Category 4, Category 5, it's engineered. And my first question to them is always, well, what happens when 75% of your workforce doesn't have roofs on their homes? So it's a function of business resiliency and planning and making this concept more mainstream so that more people can benefit from the benefits and features of it.
Thank you. Gary, how about you? We talked about this at the break a little bit.
Yeah, we did. So CBF, we work directly with our local government partners, and so that sort of largely drives our engagement. But just having worked now with the City of Hampton, they've been very effective, I think, in holding a lot of those community meetings and really, you know, going out of their way to engage various groups locally. And I think that has been an outgrowth of their Dutch Dialogues process. And so just a continuation of that work, I think, and they, at the city government level, have looked to target the business community and bring them into this process. And so I think that there has to be some leadership around that.
Has it been a hard sell?
I think everyone in the city is aware of the problem, so I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
You'll find out.
Yeah.
Sir?
Sorry.
Yep.
I know this isn't my part of it.
No, this is everybody's part of the program.
This popped into my head. You know, we're owned by a publicly traded company, I believe, and you might be able to help me with this. Sorry. This just popped into my head. We're held by a publicly traded company. They are now being scored on social and environmental investments or contributions to communities. When we made our donation to NIFWIF, I got a call from our CEO thanking me because we increased their scoring, which I don't know if it's going to credit agencies or ISS maybe, but it's going in their proxies. So my suggestion to you is if you have publicly traded companies that operate near you, to go to them and say, you have this scoring going on, if you want to enhance your rating, how about investing or charitably or at discounts into the community, because you're going to be scored on this. And if you're going to give the money to somebody, give it locally.
Good thought. Thanks, Mike. Some specific questions. Evan, for you. can parametric insurance be done on a regional scale? And do you have any suggestions for involving rural communities?
Yep, great questions. Yes, it can easily be done on a regional scale. It's done at a statewide scale right now. One of our policyholders has been the state of Louisiana, so their pool. So it could be very broad or it could be very narrow. The coverage, the bigger the area, it may affect the pricing because the larger areas are more probable to get hit than a smaller area. But it's definitely a scheme that can be put together on a region-wide basis, and we're looking at a lot of opportunities like that right now. And then the second part of the question was around
Sort of rural communities specifically.
rural communities have the same exposures, just sometimes on a smaller scale. There's still going to be debris removal. There's going to be losses. There's going to be deductibles. There's going to be needs for debris for people and overtime. Compounding that, there's going to be a decline in revenues. If some of the revenues aren't going, the permitting revenues, sales tax revenues, things like that, because the area was devastated, absolutely, it's a good use case for parametric.
Dawn, a different question for you. Given your experience in Hoboken, what recommendations would you have for communities that might be the next Hoboken to get ready?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think starting that planning process and I do recognize that if you're a community that hasn't actually been hit by a bad storm, that it's probably difficult to have that conversation. But I've thought about, whether there's ways to have workshops and, some kind of conversation with the community, every year, that if it may go out to sea and it may strike your community. And so thinking about what do you want to start doing and starting that conversation and starting that planning process. And again, I mean, I think that as we've learned today, there's a lot of different ways to try to fund projects. So trying to really go through that visioning process, working, with potentially, in the watershed or working with your neighbors, neighboring communities, to try and figure out what are potential solutions that you could implement. But doing that planning.
Please jump in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I've had the opportunity to travel a lot. It gets exhausting at times, but it's also fun. You get to see new things and meet new people. But one thing I've noticed is that when I'm in areas that have been recently affected by a major catastrophe, the conversations that we're having are very, very, very different than the conversations we're having with folks that haven't been hit in a while or ever. We term it either the recency bias, or as human beings, most of us naturally have an optimism bias. Oh, it's not going to happen. But quite frankly, burying your head in the sand is not a strategy. It's not a solution. So, preparation, I strongly encourage.
Evan, as you're out traveling, do you see that people generally are aware of parametric insurance and what it is and how it works, or are you pretty new in that process?
It's a great question. It depends where. One thing, and parametric's been around for 15, 20 years. At first it was done mainly by the reinsurance companies and by very large governments. It's now trickling down. We've been doing this as a company now for approaching 6.5 years. We're noticing an exponential increase in awareness and activity around that. When we started the business in 2013, you do a Google search on parametric insurance, you get about 2 pages. Now it goes on and on and on and on and on. So, the awareness is building and growing. And then Harvey, Irma, Maria, 2 years ago, really woke up people. And then last year, you had 2 other spots. You had North Carolina and the Florida Panhandle. So these storms are happening. They're hitting all over the place. And just because, as you mentioned, Sandy's an event that's well into the 1 in 300, 1 in 500 from a return period standpoint, that doesn't mean it can't happen again tomorrow.
Good thoughts. Gary, question for you. Does the payout structure of environmental impact bonds incentivize underperformance of green infrastructure projects?
No, that's a question we got a lot from local governments that we were presenting to. And no, because one, it's not in a city's interest to be installing infrastructure that doesn't work, right? You're gonna have to put something in the ground eventually, so you're just gonna have to pay for that double or more times. But from the, no, I would stop there. And then from the investor standpoint, they are also doing due diligence on these projects. So they will be, expecting a report on, who's installing these projects, how are they being maintained, and that is also a checking mechanism there.
Any questions from the audience not yet on cards on what we've covered so far? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Evan, how much are the anemometers? And if I said that correctly, and to get down to the rural level, do you have an idea or concept about how you could pull together communities and have the parametric trigger shared? How would you determine who got what percentage? I don't know if you've seen anything along those lines or had any thoughts.
We have, it needs to be determined up front. You need to have a loss allocation up front. It makes sense in pooling together. And from the triggering mechanisms, Virginia is a little bit different than other areas like Florida, for instance, in that the storms really are going to come from one direction. So if you're rural and inland, it's going to go over the coast in most scenarios to get it. So, we would design triggers that are very likely to respond. So, yeah. How much do they cost? The anemometers, between $50,000 and $100,000, depending upon variables.
Dawn, question for you. I sound like a game show host, don't I? How much did you rely on FEMA dollars, and what do you think Hoboken would have done if the rebuilding project would not have been successful?
Yeah, I mean, at first we didn't really get much at all from FEMA, but because of Rebuild by Design, I mean, that's funding that came in actually through HUD, but that was Sandy recovery funding that did come in. But, I was chatting with Samantha about it. I mean, we could have possibly done that resist structure as a CAT bond. And then the other, the resilience, all of the resiliency parks, the parks built with green infrastructure, and we made green infrastructure a part of absolutely every road project, has rain gardens that we're having. We made it part of every project. But again, for us, those projects were all funded using the Open Space Trust Fund and leveraging the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank. So we had other strategies that we were getting that done. So I think we would have tried to work to figure out other potential funding. But I do think, at the end of the day, I think we can all have a voice. Ultimately, what is best is that we're really optimizing the private funding and we're optimizing the public funding, and that we still have public funding. That public funding, can really be used as a way to then leverage the private sector funding. And so, I think, I don't care what your position is on climate change. We can all come together around preparedness. We all want to keep our communities safe. And so, to me, raising the conversation around resiliency, I think, is really important. And I think for Virginia, I mean, you have tremendous military assets. And so I think that there's got to be a tremendous opportunity to really move forward with that partnership, because you've got shared critical assets, and those military assets, they rely on people who maybe live off base. And I was talking to one commander in North Carolina who said, my challenge is I have 4,000 civilians working for me, and they can't get to work. They can't function. And I need them to function, and that's part of the military operation. So it really all ties together. And so I think we can all have kind of a strong voice in advocating for resiliency funding also from the federal government. I just learned at this conference that potentially they're looking at, for future events in going into next year, having 6% be available for pre-mitigation planning, and that's what we need. We need communities to be thinking about how are you planning and how are you planning on a regional basis. And so I think we should all keep pushing hard.
Do you see much dialogue between the civilian sector and the military sector on this?
Well, that was just I got invited by residents to come to New Bern, and I met, elected officials, and then I ended up meeting some commanders in the Navy who were talking to me about it. So that's really the extent of my experience. But I mean, I do think that concept of let's look at those critical. Sounds like that's already happening here in Virginia in a big way. Talking to Norfolk, and so which is. Maybe not, okay. But ideally, that's really what should be happening because obviously our military is extremely important and the operations of our military, and it extends beyond the base.
Yeah, we've seen a little of that in the Charleston area. Admiral Phillips and I were involved in a program at the Citadel in Charleston, and the whole theme of it was the impact of climate change on the military. And we had folks from Beaufort, South Carolina, and the Charleston area talking to primarily a civilian audience about the impact of climate change on the military. And it was interesting to learn what the military is doing to the extent they could talk about it, and how well prepared it seemed that it is. And also the similarities in terms of challenges that need to be addressed between the military and civilian sector. So I think that's happening.
Yeah.
Evan, this whole thing of yours has caught people's attention. Who, for parametric insurance, who's the customer?
The customer?
Yep.
It's who's ever seeking to transfer the risk. So it's everyone from governments on the sovereign side in the Caribbean to states, to local municipalities, to authorities on the public side, on the private side. It's Fortune 500s down to Main Street businesses, and eventually the homeowners. So it's anyone with an exposure to economic loss. And earlier there was a slide up there that shows that worldwide there's a problem. It's called the Natural Catastrophe Protection Gap, and that of the economic losses that these storms produce, it's pretty consistent that only about 1/3 of them are covered losses by the insurance and reinsurance industry. So you have 2/3 of the economic losses are not covered. Bringing that number home, in Superstorm Sandy, third parties estimate the total losses insurers paid, including the National Flood Insurance Program, at about $22–23 billion. Third parties estimate the total economic losses produced by Sandy was in excess of 70 billion. So that's pretty consistent. And this is North America, which is the most heavily insurance penetrated country in the world. And the size of the problem is well into the trillions. Leading catastrophe risk modeling company, RMS, about 5 years ago came out with a number where they said in North America, in what's called Tier 1 wind zones, which are coastal, from Texas all the way around the Gulf Coast and straight up the Atlantic into Maine, deductibles, just deductibles on property that's already insured, they estimated at $400 billion. Okay, that was 5 years ago, and that's every time you see a new building going up or a new house being built, that number is just growing. And that number also doesn't include what's not insured or insurable traditionally. Your landscape and debris removal, beach erosion, all the stuff that's not going to be covered. So it's a big, big problem.
How are we doing on time? We okay?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Because Norfolk has a tunnel that's central to the accessing and in and out, could you describe maybe what the MTA has done and the fact that you can get parametric triggers not just for wind?
Yep. You know, I'm glad you brought that up. And then a lot of areas that have a big surge exposure, we have the ability to do either wind speed trigger or storm surge height trigger. And as I said up there earlier, our job as a underwriter for this is to make sure that we're designing structures that are cost efficient and effective, yet most likely to trigger and to cover your losses when they occur. So what the MTA did following Sandy, they were having difficulty obtaining the insurance that they needed from the traditional market. So at that time, they went and created the first storm surge only parametric cat bond. So they accessed the capital markets investors, and they had RMS work with their engineers, and the number that all the engineering kind of came up with, and they put a lot of science into this, was that the tunnels going into New York City flood at about 10.3 feet. So that's where the problem begins. Base flood elevation in the battery in lower Manhattan is 5.6 feet. Sandy produced 11.33 feet of surge coming into lower Manhattan. So what the MTA did was created a bond. It was with an index function, which can be a little bit complicated at times, but in essence, it started paying out once the surge level hits 8.5 feet at the battery, or there were other areas as well, Rockaway and a few other areas in the New York City area. But for a place like Virginia, where there's a surge exposure, we would recommend engaging some engineering, figuring out exactly where and what levels the problem starts occurring, and then we design an instrument that attaches below those levels to make sure that it's going to recover, or there will be recovery when it's needed.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. I have a question, but to comment, I wanted to. Norfolk does work with the Navy and the military quite a bit. So we have a great working relationship. The piece of the puzzle that we don't have is funding. We have 38% of our land isn't taxable because of the largest naval base in the world, the second busiest port, and all of those sailors and civilians and truck drivers going on and off the port are not paying for the flooded roads. So that's another issue. I wanted to talk about the political will issue, right? So you've got elected officials, Mayor Zimmer, myself. Unfortunately, we're the only two here. We have a problem. We have a problem convincing our elected officials at the local, the state, and the federal level that this is an issue. Obviously, we have all the data in the world. We've been talking about it all day long. But nobody is moving on this in the way that they should. So what is going to get us there? Is it going to be when we're voted in, is it the voters who are going to be demanding this? And we're seeing more and more of this after we had an issue with Hurricane Matthew. How do we get there? So we've talked about the idea of simulation games, simulation ideas, visually providing this to both the homeowners and the business owners as well as the elected officials. But we need the data and we need the funding for that. And I'm thinking the insurance industry would be a great source to help create this and almost gamify it. We need Sim City for flooding, right? Yeah. And we have a great modeling and simulation center at Old Dominion University, and they've got some ideas on this. But are you all seeing anything about this? Because we've got to get something that's going to push the buttons of the voters, who push the buttons of the elected to get this stuff funded. We have the money, we have the need. Why isn't this getting done?
Mike, you want to talk on the? No, I don't want to talk anymore. Okay. Well, good, Sam. It's not for me to advise on what Virginia ought to do. I can tell you a little bit on what's worked in South Carolina, but please go ahead, Sam.
Sure. Well, and I can kick it off because I think what we'll find is that there's some common themes, but this has to be treated like a grassroots campaign, like any other campaign around education, mobilization, and so this is where data and visualization, I'm a bit of a SimCity geek myself and love the flood resilience of my particular city. We'll continue that in sidebar, but the more that you can be putting this information in front of key stakeholders, community leaders, and the influencers of your community, it might be someone in the faith-based community or a particularly charismatic science teacher or a broadcast meteorologist, but who are those trusted voices that you can be bringing into the clarion call to action for the community? We've also seen really good success of organizing around national preparedness strategies and America's Preparathon. I'm not quite sure how active that's been in the last 2 years, but it's certainly a good platform for getting at information that's available on ready.gov, and a lot of those materials are very tailorable. And then again, working with insurance and catastrophe modeling partners who can produce those the visualizations and help folks understand these are the streets at risk, these are the structures at risk, these are the schools and public health facilities that are the most at risk. Some of that could get a little controversial because that might also show homes or businesses that are at risk. But sometimes we've really got to step up and show that courage and depict for the community visually, this is what's coming. And you can either prepare in advance, or you can be on the back end dealing with massive unmet need and real existential threats. But as much as you can be treating it like a grassroots campaign and organize, the more success that you're going to have. Interestingly, there are partners, even in insurance, who can help you think some of that through and provide some of that technical assistance even before you think about engaging the markets in insurance or cat bonds, but really thinking about what those communication strategies might be. There are also partners in the architectural and engineering community, some of them are here in the room, who are also geared toward thinking in that way and partnering with you.
I would agree with that. I think what we've found to be successful in the Charleston region is to really focus getting community leaders to communicate with people in the community about what the risks are, what the problems may be, and what possible solutions are. And what we've found, and we've worked really hard at it, is the development of sort of visual data that sort of shows what can happen. You know, none of it's for certain, but sort of the visual impact of some of that is really pretty powerful. And what we think is needed, though, is to combine showing that kind of possible problem, which can be pretty scary, with the need for solutions and hope to address those things, and then use that to build momentum and backing.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I mean, I agree with you that like trying to help those elected leaders just sort of sit down and really sort of visualize like what could this mean for your community, I think is important, but also helping them to see that, you know, it is a risk and also it's an opportunity. I mean, so it's an opportunity for communities to be much stronger into the future and to plan in a different way and to develop in a different way. And so you're really just talking about like sitting down and trying to figure it out and do it in a way that you can convert into an opportunity. Because I think at the end of the day, people don't really respond well to, and that's part of the challenge, is like, oh, it's a, you know, like I don't really want to think about how negative it could be. Like at the end of the day, it's an opportunity, and that's what I tried to convey to Hoboken residents. Like, this is an opportunity. We're going to have a great new waterfront park that we were going to build before, but now we're going to build it as a, you know, something that really protects the community as well. So
And again, we're having the same experience. Evan?
Yeah, so anecdotally, we agree. You're trying to get budget and fund things, and it can be challenging. It could take a long time to get folks around, but it's definitely an issue that we all want to be in front of. You know, just give you an example, when Irma hit Florida, there was an area in Miami called Coral Gables that was hit a little bit harder than it should have been. They lost electricity for a long time, and the mayor was very vocal. I think he even went and filed a lawsuit against the utility, FPL, because it was taking a while to get power restored. And then it went away very quickly when FPL pulled out a file of all of the recommendations that they've been ignoring to trim the trees for the last 10 or 15 years. So it's definitely something that you want to be in front of. You know, as I said earlier, you know, digging your head in the sand and ignoring what is a mathematical almost certainty over time is not a strategy.
Another question for Gary. Can using an EIB to install green infrastructure improve a locality's community rating system?
I don't see why not. I think that sort of whatever goal, the EIB is a flexible instrument, right? So it can be designed around whatever goal the city is looking to achieve. Sorry.
Elizabeth?
yeah, well, Samantha's saying it can. But
Is this on? There it is. We have an expert on the CRS scoring over here, Mary Carson. She thought she could just sit there and digest her tiramisu. But, you know, she might want to weigh in on that. I will confess that I'm the one who asked, can it improve a community CRS score? Because I think it's a great question for us to discuss.
Right.
Sure. Hi, Mary Carson Stiff. I'm with Wetlands Watch. And I think the answer, I forget who asked it actually. Was it from the moderator? Okay, great. Unfortunately, we haven't been successful in getting CRS credit for individual parcel level green infrastructure projects. The way that the CRS program works, they want to see those projects protect to a certain level of storm. And where we are in coastal Virginia, if you protect to a 100-year storm and you're talking about some sort of major retrofit, you just can't make a hole big enough to get that capacity. So it's a problem for us. Wetlands Watch has been working to try to reform the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system to achieve credits for small parcel level best management practices, which would include a lot of the stormwater retrofits that would be included in an environmental impact bond. But we just haven't been very successful. It's kind of a slow train, and we're continuing that effort, and maybe we'll have some success in the future, but not sure.
Thank you. And if I could follow up on that. So we've heard Dawn talk about the importance of making plans, and Evan talked about preparedness, and Mike talked about public education, and Sam weighed in just now with grassroots efforts, right, at education. It's really hard, I'll tell you honestly, it is very hard to get local government representatives to come out because you all are often understaffed. But what we found in working with local governments is that sometimes the staff is more aware of this issue than the elected officials are. And so I would just like to reiterate what they've all said, which is public education is so key. And the more you can take this back from today and talk about it and the need to get more information about it, the more helpful I think it will be to all of us.
Thank you. Gary, you keep getting questions, I guess, because you've raised a lot of interest in what you're doing. What metrics are you using to determine under or over performance?
Right. So that that again is determined by the city itself. So whatever. So in the case of Washington D.C., they looked at flow and stormwater flow. In Baltimore, they're looking at plant survival as their metric, and in Hampton, it's yet to be determined.
Thank you. Evan, one more for you, sir. What other perils is parametric insurance covering?
It's natural catastrophes, storm surge and hurricane, earthquake, their rising water, inland flooding is being explored, as well as convective storm and hail at the present time.
And are your clients, I mean, are they banks and airports, and, I mean, is it across the spectrum?
All the above, banks, airports.
Agriculture?
Yes. So is getting back to the protection gap, and it's anytime there's an event, it highlights just how little is actually covered and how big the economic losses are and the knock-on economic effects. There's Caribbean islands that, it's been a year and a half, almost 2 years post-Irma and Maria, and they're still not back to normal. It takes a long time to recover when these extreme events occur.
Thank you. Don, we talked a little bit at dinner about the importance of engaging the underserved communities as part of the whole collective effort of getting all of the constituents involved. Would you address that a bit?
Yeah, so we worked really hard. As I said, the housing authority, it's on the western side of the city. It had the deepest water. I think they had the 10 feet of water. But their apartments start on the second floor, so luckily there were not residents that were, they were inside their apartments, but their actual homes were not flooded in our housing authority. But the experience, I mean, on a couple fronts. I mean, one is I do, for some communities, for a place like Hoboken, I've really focused on shelter-in-place strategy, and that's why I think like the microgrid strategy is important to keeping communities safe. I mean, what we saw in places like the Housing Authority was, their backup generators got flooded, and everyone was in the dark but congregating in community rooms. And so if you can have community rooms and hallways lit, you know, that's a way to really keep them safe through the storm. And they don't have the resources to evacuate, they refuse to evacuate, but if you can help them to be prepared, there are ways to really keep them safe. As far as the rebuild by design process, I mean, I made sure I was part of appointing a community advisory group. I made sure to have residents from the Housing Authority on that, and then we would have meetings in the Housing Authority, both with the entire community invited, but also just separate meetings just with Housing Authority residents so that they felt comfortable expressing their views. And you know, they're a really important part of the process. But the challenge for us with our project is that the intervention that needs to happen to hold back that water from getting to the western side of the city is all along the waterfront, away from the Housing Authority, so it's not directly impacting them. So it was always a challenge to get them as engaged as the people who were angry about having something right by their house.
Sam, I'm going to ask you a question. You're not in the panel, but I hope you'll answer this. One of the things, as we've listened today about the various forms of financing, various kinds of bonds, various things, and grants, you know, the challenge, I think, in sorting it through is how do all of these things fit together? And what type of financial instrument is best for what type of problem? And how do you sort through all that? Because if you don't do it every day like you do, it's pretty overwhelming.
It really can be, and we think of it as a patchwork quilt of both private sector resources and innovative instruments and things that are coming to market, as well as things that are traditionally in play around both insurance and debt, and public resources that are certainly available through the U.S. federal government, but as well as some state agencies. And so each landscape, each scale, each challenge does call for a tailored approach to scan across the range of options available through the federal government and state government, and the range of options available through the private sector. If I were to, you know, top line some of it, because I don't want to. We could spend 2 hours just talking about that, right? But I would say the tough news is that by and large, grants and lower cost capital being steered more toward unmet needs, low to moderate income is probably getting the best chances of success and traction. So for example, if you're looking at programs through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or similar programs where it's really targeting unmet needs for low to moderate income individuals, those grants are going toward those unmet needs first. Whereas loans are going to be geared more toward where that ability to repay is available. There's a lot more to say about, you know, federal prioritization, but I think that's where a lot of this is heading, with a particular emphasis on things like infrastructure projects, where the lower cost access to those funds are probably going to go toward those unmet needs first. Whereas loans, I think, are probably going to come into play a lot more in meeting America's infrastructure deficit, which is breathtakingly enormous. And from the private sector side, what I really like, I think, is what Evan has described elegantly as the three-legged stool, where pairing parametric solutions with existing insurance solutions, and maybe not thinking of them as interchangeable, is a really smart way to go, and using parametric insurance to meet that gap around things like deductible and overtime for first responders, or your utility staff, and also in the context of flood risk and the National Flood Insurance Program, where the increased cost of compliance, or ICC, is capped. That may not be enough to rebuild homes to be higher. You know, you may be looking at something over and above what ICC can provide at $30,000, but a parametric program that's covering the entire community being made available for folks who purchase insurance, can both incentivize folks to go out and get the flood insurance that they need, but may not be a requirement of their mortgage, but they can then access that additional funding through a parametric program to rebuild their home higher, rebuild their home stronger, or rebuild elsewhere but stay within your tax base. We've also seen use of the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG-DR funds, and Don might be able to speak to this, to provide additional incentives over and above fair market value, where residents are staying within that jurisdiction, which I know is an area of concern for mayors and leaders who are concerned about tax base. So there are ways that you can use these different resources creatively, but in a tailored patchwork quilt approach to meet your needs locally. Big fan of environmental impact bonds, and I want to go actually back and think creatively and talk with FEMA about ways that environmental impact bonds, forest resilience bonds, natural resource solutions could be factored into the CRS, because it not only helps to defray the costs that can be lowering the hydrograph even a little bit, but it also helps on stormwater quality benefits, and that can go a long way for the community. There's a reason that there's stormwater quality credit in the CRS to begin with. So what are some ways that we can, creatively work there? But it's a tailored approach that takes, some time and assembling some smart people to help think through the range of options that are available.
Thanks, Sam. That's a great overview. Each of you have sort of closing thoughts. I think we've sorted through a lot of stuff, and there's still more to talk about, but it may have to be for another day. Dawn?
Well, I would just say, again, it's all about the preparation and the planning, and think big and work collaboratively. And as we've learned a lot about different ways to fund things, and so I wouldn't let the funding stop you from the visioning process and figuring out what the potential solutions can be, and just keep pushing hard. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's good to meet a lot of you. What I'm going to do is just highlight the fact that it's planning and preparation. I wish I had videos of some of the people that I've seen and interacted with that have been in Puerto Rico or in places in Florida that have been hit really hard. And it's amazing how receptive they are and how inquisitive and open they are to these solutions. But what happened yesterday over there has got zero bearing on what's going to happen tomorrow anywhere else. So plan ahead.
Sure. I think through this project, I've gotten a chance to travel a lot across Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland, and there's a lot of good work happening on the ground, and just more opportunities like this to sort of highlight and elevate that work and bring more resources to it is always welcome.
Well, thank you, panel. Great job. Just closing on my part, I think we've just touched the surface of a lot of interesting and complex stuff. We plan to follow up and sort of drill deeper on a lot of these topics, and include, as we talked about this morning, other folks that need to be at the table to help solve these problems. But this was a good first day so far. Thank you all very much for your time.